This is HERkys Voice, a conversation with special Hawkeye guests focusing on the stories and people behind Hawkeye athletics. Now, here's the host of HERkys Voice, Iowa women's tennis coach, Sasha Schmid.
Welcome to HERkys Voice. Today is our final episode of Season 2 for HERkys Voice. Thank you for tuning in and listening. We are so grateful. Season 3 will begin in August, and we have so much to celebrate in the year ahead. This week, we prepare to honor the life and legacy of our Hawkeye trailblazer, Dr. Christine Grant, at her Celebration of Life Memorial Service on Sunday, May 22nd at 3 p.m. at Carver Hawkeye Arena. The service is open to the public, and we hope you can join us in person or online for this very special day as we pay tribute to the incredible life and legacy of Dr. Grant. Earlier this spring, the 3 Women for Equality, Christine Grant, Peggy Burke, and Bonnie Slatton Fund, was created to provide support for the Iowa Women's Archives at the University of Iowa Libraries. Our Women's Archives houses many important collections featuring women and girls in sports, including papers from Dr. Burke, Dr. Slatton, and Dr. Grant. This week on HERkys Voice, we get to feature a conversation I had the honor of recording with Dr. Peggy Burke and Dr. Bonnie Slatton. We visited about their life stories, journey to Iowa, the incredible historic work they did as academic leaders on our campus, and behalf of the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, championing equity and athletics for women and girls. They reflected on many memories and moments from their life, many that they shared with Dr. Christine Grant. And as we end Season 2 and honor Dr. Grant with this episode today and her memorial service on Sunday, I wanted to share with you one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Grant. It's a quote she actually delivered in 2002 during a speech she was giving to the Iowa Women's Archives. It goes, "I chose my career because I love sport, but what gave me the passion to continue to fight for equal opportunities was the unshakable belief that a sport can truly empower a woman, perhaps better than any other experience." Thanks everybody for listening, and enjoy this wonderful conversation with Dr. Peggy Burke and Dr. Bonnie Slatton. Welcome to HERkys Voice. I have to tell you guys, since our first episode aired in October of 2020, I have been looking forward to the day when I would be able to sit down and record with Dr. Bonnie Slatton and Dr. Peg Burke, women who were leaders on our campus and nationally recognized in their advocacy for equal opportunities for women and girls in sport. They joined Dr. Christine Grant in being fierce advocates for the passage and full implementation of the Title IX legislation. They each served as president of the Association of Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, the AIAW. And they both also chaired our UI Department of Physical Education. Dr. Peg Burke, welcome to HERkys Voice.
Thank you.
Dr. Bonnie Slatton, welcome to HERkys Voice.
Thank you.
I'm so happy you guys have taken time from your days and joined me here. I have been waiting for this conversation, and I have so many questions. I think where I'd love to start is perhaps with you, Dr. Burke, with your life story. I know you are a native of Kentucky. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, tell me a little bit. You were born in 1933.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about your parents and growing up, and how did you find your way actually into sport?
That's quite an interesting story. I was born in a little poverty pocket in eastern Kentucky, and my parents were farmers. And I went to a one-room school for 8 years, and it was an interesting time then. The teacher, at least later in some of the later years, she would go home for lunch and just leave the school ground to us, if you can imagine that in today's litigation age. But so we made the rules, and we did our own games, mainly tag and Andy over, and softball was a biggie. And our softball was kind of a challenge because there were oak trees, and it was a gullied playground, and down first base line was the girls' outhouse. And so we had to make up ground rules for that If it went into the outhouse, it was in play, unless it was occupied at the time, and then it was ground rule double. So we made up our own rules. And then I went to the county high school. I rode 3 buses to get to and from the high school. And there we had this lovely gymnasium, which the only time I set foot on was to help decorate for the senior prom. Because the boys had physical education, the girls didn't. No, nothing. So my only sports was growing up with brothers and playing softball and general games. And so when I went to college majoring in English and business. And I found, of all things, that there was such a thing called a physical education major. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. So I switched my business major and became an English and physical education major.
And what university did you attend?
Morehead State University in Kentucky.
And what was it about physical education and that major where you found a home?
Well, I had always loved being active, and that just gave me a chance to be active with other people. And so it was just, I really enjoyed it.
Did you, growing up and going through your different, whether it might be this one-room schoolhouse and high school and college, were there times when you came across teachers or mentors in your life that really impacted you or kind of changed the direction of your life?
Well, I think the importance of women was shown clearly in my majors, because my English teachers were women and my business teacher was women. So that's what I went to college majoring in, because those were the role models I had had.
Yeah.
And yes, it's extremely important. And then, of course, my physical education teachers at college were quite important.
And from there, what was your next step?
My next step, I went to Indiana to teach in the public schools, and I taught there 2 years. And then I went to Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, and taught there 4 years. And then I decided I wanted to work on my doctorate. And so I was shopping around again for the programs that were known for their strong women. And it was Gladys Scott here at Iowa and Eleanor Matheny at Southern Cal. And I was offered an assistantship both places. And at that time, my father was elderly and not well, and I didn't want to be that far from home. So I chose Iowa rather than Southern Cal. I often wonder how my life would have been different if I'd have gone to Southern Cal in the 60s.
Yes, right. So what year did you end up coming to the University of Iowa?
1963.
Okay. And what was it like here in 1963?
Well, we had the women's gymnasium, Halsey Gymnasium, with a balcony around it, so the basketball might hit the balcony, and the activity space. And we had club sports, but we had no organized intercollegiate sport at that point.
And what were you studying when you arrived? What were you?
I was studying physical education,
Okay.
majoring in physical education.
And it was really one of the departments that continues to change names throughout our history at the University of Iowa.
Absolutely.
At that time, what was the name?
It was a women's physical education.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. Yes. Dr. Bonnie Slatton, let's hear your story and tell us where you grew up and how you journeyed here to the University of Iowa.
Well, I'm from, Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was in a working class neighborhood, and I could walk to all the schools, elementary, junior high, and high, the church, stores 2 blocks from the house. So I thought I was rich that I had all these. And the community center, which I could crawl through the fence. And I could walk a block and go through a gate, but I wanted to crawl through the fence. So, but it had 1 concrete tennis court, which I spent all of my young years on. People said, "Oh, you won't be able to walk when you're 20." But I luckily had no trouble with that.
You have always loved tennis.
I've always loved tennis. But I loved all sports. I played. There weren't chances to play in school, so being at the community center, we would have teams that would play other community centers in different parts of the town. So that was a great opportunity. And I played basketball, softball, just about any sports. but I mainly played tennis
Yeah.
and badminton. People said you can't play both of those because one uses a wrist and one you don't want to use your wrist. And I said, well, I haven't found a problem with that.
Yeah.
So I just continued. I had a good physical education teacher in high school, and she had what was called the Brownie Patrol. She even had shirts made with, they were brown checks. And she would say, okay, all of you girls that are really good, you can help me in teaching. So we had our own little club.
Oh, very
that did
good.
that. So then as I went through, I didn't really plan to go to college. I didn't really think about that. But a psychology teacher in high school thought that I needed to go to college. And so he wrote to Middle Tennessee State, and he said, if you want to have a really good student, he recommended me, and I got a scholarship that was like $200, I think, and it paid for everything.
Wow. And so you went to Murfreesboro.
Yeah, went to Middle Tennessee State and majored in English and physical education.
That's so interesting. You have that in common, the two of you.
We do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the English teacher, who I just loved, and also the head of the physical education, they were just wonderful, wonderful men. And when I was graduating and deciding what I wanted to do, the English professor said, well, I would love to have you in the profession of English, but your chances for moving up are much better in physical education. Because if you look, the professors in English are mainly men. So he kind of was pushing me that way, but he had a friend in Lakeland, Florida. It's a little town called Mulberry, Florida, who was a principal of a school system. And he called him, he said, I've got your next physical education teacher. So I took that job and was there for a couple of years and ended up going back to teach English at Middle Tennessee for a year. And then I decided I probably needed to get a master's degree. So I went to Greensboro, North Carolina. And like 5 of the professors there were from Iowa.
Really?
And when it was time to graduate, they said, well, you should go to Iowa and get some experience. There's no better place. And I said, you got to be kidding. I've never been west of the Mississippi or north of the Mason-Dixon line. Why would you send me to such a godforsaken place? So they've kidded me about that over the years that I'm still here.
I know. And you still have your nice Southern draw. That's never left. I always love that.
She mentioned one of her teachers, and I've got to tell you experience I had. I had a history professor, and I was doing okay in his class. And one day he called me in and said, what are you doing, wasting your time in physical education? And this was a man who at that time was training for the Olympics in the hammer throw. He valued movement that much, but saw it as a waste of my time.
Yeah.
So what made Iowa special then with when you guys were converging here?
I got involved with the women's groups quite early on, and there were some exciting people there who were starting to raise a ruckus about discrimination.
Yes.
And then I found out Dr. Scott called me in one day and asked me to represent them with this new organization called the Iowa AIW, that it was just organizing the state organization. And so I went to the meeting, and at that meeting, Parsons College, which is down at Fairfield, it's now
Yes.
called Maharishi University, they were offering scholarships. And at that first meeting I went to of AIW, they were proposing that we boycott them because they were giving women scholarships. And I had no instructions from anyone, but I just said, the University of Iowa will not boycott them. And I saw this woman from Drake, Judy Bischoff, nodding her head. She said, Drake won't either.
Oh.
And so we broke that little boycott that was going to be because they were giving scholarships to women.
Wow. Well, and thank goodness you attended.
Yes. And then ultimately, I ended up becoming president of AIW, which I think surprised everyone since I wasn't even in sports.
So how did that happen? I wanted to ask you about that.
Well, I think it was my big mouth. We went early on. We went at one of the early AIW conventions.
It was her hats, too.
I wore hats then.
You got noticed.
It was at one of the conventions, the NCAA had brought forth a proposal. They were having a parallel convention somewhere that they were going to start women's sports. And so they had a representative at our meeting. And when I got to the microphone and addressed him, I said, did you ask the women on your campus about whether they wanted you to start women's programs? No. I said, did you consult with the AIW officials? No. I said, well, in some circumstances involving men and women, lack of consent is classified as rape. And I think it was that statement that got attention.
Wow. Wow. And why was it, take us back through the history of that. I mean, the AIAW was women governing women.
Correct.
And really felt like it was working out pretty well.
Yes. Yes.
And had the opportunity to be forward thinking and progressive with a lot of the different models you were creating at that time.
Right.
So what was it about that time period where it felt like the NCAA was going to come in and take over that entire structure and now run women's sports?
Well, Bonnie can probably speak to this more than I can because she was the acting executive director of AIW for a year. But we were starting to get a television contract, and we felt that they were partially threatened by that we might become more financially independent and that we had to be stopped, was my feeling of it at least. And Bonnie, you might want to speak to that.
Yeah, there was a real feeling that women's sports should not become an enterprise for making money, which they saw in the direction for the NCAA. So some of the people that didn't want women to organize in that way did it for very good reasons. Mm-hmm. But as it progressed, the women like Peg and Christine and others started saying, if men can get scholarships to go to college, then it becomes a real civil rights issue.
Yeah.
And so that argument started, and of course this was right at the beginning of Title IX. It just passed, and so they became very strong. We all became very strong advocates for writing implementation language for Title IX, which in the beginning everyone said, well, it's just something that affects sport. Well, it was never anything that just affected sport. It affected education generally. So if you look at the timeline of what happened to women in education, starting in 1973, law schools started accepting women. They hadn't before. The membership or the participation in medical schools, all the professional schools started to increase and recruit women. In addition to that, of course, on the sports side, we were really pushing that all institutions have an organized sport program for women. And we knew immediately, I mean, it wasn't a guess that the NCAA men's sports was opposed to it, because we later discovered that it wasn't for any sexist reasons, which some were, but it was looking down the road of what would happen financially with the NCAA and intercollegiate sport generally. The women in AIW really wanted to change NCAA. They wanted the AIW, as it organized, to change sport totally so that it wasn't such a business enterprise, that it kept education at the heart of what it did. So you can look at the model that was created, and I think even to this day, women who were involved in the organization at the beginning keep thinking, what if we'd succeeded? And Peg can tell you about the vote that would have allowed us to do that.
What year was this vote?
Actually, Bonnie, I wasn't at that convention, but apparently they had a vote, and it was a tie. And so they called a recess, and they went out and lobbied and lobbied and lobbied, and when they came back and voted again, they voted to take over women's sports. But back to your original question, I think the treasurer of the NCAA, in a meeting we were having with him once, said it, the real reason for it. He said, we don't want anyone with their hand in our pocket over whom we have no control. So I think that summed it up pretty well. They did not want the outlay that they were going to have to put to women's sports. And of course, they tried twice to exempt it through the Tower Amendments. Senator Tower of Texas brought first the First Amendment, which was to exempt athletics from Title IX. And that went nowhere. Senator Pell was chairing the committee. I think it was the Education Committee. And then the second one was to exempt the revenue-producing sports, which again would have taken all the money, basically. And so I testified in Congress against that one. And both of the Tower Amendments were defeated. And so, but that's how close athletics came to not even being included in Title IX.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is the story that I love telling and learning about, is that, we are celebrating 50 years of Title IX this year. And so, many statistics and data to point to the massive impact it has had on our society. We still have a long way to go, but, once it passed June 23rd, 1972, that was really such a small portion of the story. The fight for defeating the amendments in all of the ways that efforts were put forward to dilute the impact of this legislation.
Right.
And what I'm struck by is the leadership of both of you and Dr. Grant from Iowa City, Iowa, to continue to fight and battle and work for full implementation was historic, and what I believe it will be a source of pride for our community for years and years to come, for the work that you all did. And I'm kind of curious just to hear about your stories, shedding a light on how difficult that was, and why you continued to show up and battle despite some really difficult defeats, one of them being the vote for the AIAW to merge with the NCAA.
Well, I'm going to go back to college for this, because in my day, of course, all we had were sports days and play days, in which we crammed into cars that if the students owned them, or the teacher would always drive one of them, of course. Played in our physical education uniforms. If it was an overnight sports day, we'd sleep on gymnasium floors. And paid for the gas, pooled our money, paid for the gas, paid for our meals, and so forth. And at this time, of course, I was paying the same fee at college to support sport as the men were paying. And we just accepted it, that that's the way it was. And along somewhere in the 60s, I started becoming angry at the inequities that I had endured and I had allowed to be visited on my students and my athletes.
Yes.
And that's when I really got irritated and started fighting. And seeing discrimination is a one-way bridge. Once you've crossed it, you can't uncross it again.
You were going through those kind of struggles while at the same time really trying to argue nationally why we needed to keep fighting, why we needed to fight for Title IX, and why we needed to fight NCAA from a takeover of women's sports.
Yeah.
So
what was it about? You mentioned if the AIAW had won that vote and had proceeded, we would have probably a completely different model. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. I definitely understand, it would have been less of a business model and more of a model that had education and sport and education through sport at the forefront. What do you think potentially could have evolved from that? I think I ask you that because I think it's a time for me to be reflecting as we're going through even more and more business model decision making. The amount of money that's come into the NCAA is unimaginable when you were back in the late 1970s. And it seems like an appropriate time to reflect on values and make sure that we're living the values we want to live. So when you were thinking back in terms of the model that the AIAW wanted to create and was working towards, what were the special aspects of that that think made it uniquely different than an NCAA model?
One thing had to do with recruiting and the invasion and the pressure placed on high school students in making the decision of where to go to college. AIW was attempting to limit recruiting much more than certainly it's currently done. They were hoping to keep salaries of coaches more in line with that of faculty people. It was just and the invasion on student lives, how many games is enough and how many certainly encroach on their ability to be students. Those were all things that the AIW was concerned about.
Well, and basically it was, from the very beginning of AIW, we had a student on every board, on every part of AIW. And their vote was the same as mine. So, and we thought that was really important because the student should be the center of the program. And that certainly was not true. In fact, you probably looked up this date, but the NCAA finally had student representation. We would go to meetings and we would take young women who were on our board to the meetings, but there were never any men. And eventually the men's program said, we better get men on these boards because, what they had to say was really important to listen.
Mm-hmm. And we had Amy Wilson on our podcast, and one of the things that struck me about what she was talking about is how challenging it was for both of you and Dr. Grant to realize that although you had made progress with the passage of Title IX and were working for those regulations, to be implemented in a full effect, not soon after you may have felt like you made some progress in the late 70s with some of the implementations and the defeat of the Tower Amendments. It was very quick around the corner that the vote to have the NCAA take over women's sports took place. And so what were your thoughts and feelings coming off of one triumph and effort that you felt was making progress, and then had to feel like also at the same time, a couple weeks later, a setback?
I think for the people, I was back home at that time. I wasn't actively involved. But I think for the people who were still in the leadership roles, devastation is the only term that I can think of. And I know that was especially true of Bonnie and Christine, that just to see that vote and to know that they were going to encroach and that there was no way financially that AIW could continue to exist if NCAA was going to start the programs. It was really, again, for me, it was infuriating.
Mm-hmm.
Fit into my anger.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was infuriating, and I don't think there's anything that was ever more disappointing to Christine than that vote. But as we all know, Christine pulled up her boots and said, okay, this is what we have to do.
Bonnie, that was also a difficult personal moment from her, because the stories that I have heard, that was where she gave a very impassioned speech and was catcalled by the audience.
Yep. She was. I'm not quite sure how to say this, but she really respected a lot of the men in NCAA and really felt that her argument and those of others would eventually
Prevail,
and we would be able to have a system that had at its heart the student athlete, the student experience. She and I guess it was in '79, that we went to New York to meet with the then chair of the NBC Sports. And his mother had been a physical educator, by the way, to talk about the television contract for women's sports. Because as we started thinking about, okay, how are women going to fit into this system, keeping at the heart the student-athlete experience? And also, fundamentally, you've got to figure out a way to financially exist. And so we met with him. This is before the 1980 Olympics, which ended up, we didn't go. But he said, okay, we will put AIW events on television. And Margot Polivy, who's the legal counsel for AIW, said, I think we need more than that. And she looked at me and I said, yes, we need to know that you'll put all women's sports. We don't want just basketball. We don't want just the popular sports. If you're going to do women's sports, it doesn't mean you have to do full games and full seasons, but all women's sports have to be on NBC. And he agreed to that.
Wow.
So we felt that we had really put ourselves in a good position to move forward. But with the takeover, that contract was gone. So.
And here we are in 2022, still working for media rights for all women's collegiate sports. Bonnie?
Yeah, it's some people ask me all the time, well, what kept Christine from making the same arguments over and over again for 40 years? And I said, belief in what she was doing. She never, the most down she was after that vote in the 1980s. But she said, there's got to be another way. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep pushing. And I think that's the way a lot of us, we said, okay, how can we contribute? We had at that time, the faculty representatives from all the Big Ten institutions were men, of course. And we said, well, there should be a woman's viewpoint within the faculty reps, because they were the ones that were really looking at the student athlete. Some schools started sending a second representative, and they were all women. So all of a sudden we had created a structure again where the men were here, and all the important financial decisions were made by that group, and the faculty reps were over here. So that took, during the whole 1980s, to work. And the Big Ten was one of the leaders eventually in that fight, but we had to really fight through the Big Ten to get really what eventually became kind of an equal representation for men and women. But we had an AD once that stood up in a meeting, and someone had put a question to the women's administrator at that school. And the man spoke up loudly and said, "My woman will speak when I say she can speak." Bump, Elliot stood up and he said, "You sit down and do not speak again."
Wow.
So it was, there were tough times, and sometimes you were in tears, and the women administrators, I mean, the faculty reps kept saying, women administrators should be in all these decisions. Well, why should they be in all these decisions? They're not putting money on the table. And we said, well, you aren't either. We are all collectively doing that. So it's just those kind of struggles that you kept thinking, okay, we're gonna get there, and we're gonna get there with the program that we want to have, which the money kept growing, and the decisions about how programs should progress with television contracts. And a lot of women left the profession during those years because they said, this is what I wanted to spend my life doing. So.
Well, I'm struck because, it occurs, a couple things. I mean, one, Dr. Burke, I'm struck by, when you said, even going back to the structure of the fees, there are times when you suddenly see something different, something that's always been in front of you, and you've taken it as the way it is, and suddenly a light bulb clicks and it thinks, no, this is not right. I had a moment like that in the summer of 2020 when we were in a financial crisis with the pandemic, and we were going to be short on revenues because we might not have a football season. And it was very crystal clear that this entire structure was on the basis of the TV contract for football that may or may not have happened because of a natural pandemic. And so that felt like, wait, this we need to think about the financial structure, and women's sports need to financially become as independent as possible so that we can be supporting ourselves. It was part of the initial motivation for this podcast, to tell our stories and create a value with our community. And so I'm struck listening, Bonnie, to you talking about the original contract that we could have had for women's sports, to have every women's sport on television, which would have changed the course in financial independence for women's sports, and which was never allowed to come to be. Yep. And there is a balance that I often admire from Dr. Grant's perspective in terms of not fully going into this business model of collegiate athletics and losing some values. But at the same time, we do need to have financial independence and be able to support ourselves. That's how we can make decisions and create and govern ourselves. And boy, this story combines all of that in fighting for independence and fighting for financial independence and losing that battle and losing decision-making power. And all of those things it tells the story, and it brings us to a lot of the situations that we're confronting today. And my hope is that by telling these stories, it sheds a light on our current times, and we can learn lessons from the past, and we can start to create a better, more informed, inclusive future, especially for women's athletics and for the incredible value that women's athletics brings to our society as a whole. For me, I continue to every day just be in awe that I found my way to the University of Iowa and Dr. Grant was my athletic director. It's like one of those things that strikes me in more powerful ways as I hit my midlife. How did each of you first meet Dr. Grant? What were your first memories of her, and how did you end up forging this incredible friendship?
Well, I was her master's thesis advisor. She was doing it, I think, something on the biomechanics of a golf swing. And I spent endless hours editing, working on it. And then she decided she would go straight through and get her doctorate and forget about her master's. So it sat on a shelf somewhere. It never even became a thesis. So I never let her forget the hours that I spent on that. But I think the first thing probably that I noticed about her was her accent and her scheduling, and that I think was probably the first thing I noticed about her.
She was always looking for the good that was around, I think. And she, like Peg said, her accent, I always said, people listen to her. They said, well, why do you think they keep listening to her? I said, it's her accent. I said, if you listen to her speak in front of a group, you can tell what kind of group it is by how heavy her accent is.
Really?
She used that to her advantage, I think.
Well, I'm struck with her when I hear these stories, because it's one thing to consistently make the same argument for 40, 50 years, but it's also hard to walk into these rooms where you knew that you were going to be giving a speech that could be received adversely by the crowd. And I'm kind of with Peg. I would get a little mad. I side with you on some of that, frustrations and infuriations and anger. And she had a way of staying calm and getting that message across. And I've admired that discipline. And maybe it was the accent too that could kind of disarm them. And she used pauses really well. And she also always had great data that almost cut through the emotions.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the thing I'm sure Amy talks about, because in really tutoring Amy through her PhD, and she would always say, you've got to have data. If you have data, they can't argue. And you've got to make sure your data is correct. So her students, and later a lot of the people she worked with, would get so frustrated, they would say, well, we could just, she said, no, we can't just. She said, you get the data. And we couldn't get data from NCAA. She said, we can get it, and we will. And she did. She got data on every institution in the country, which is how she started building the data bank that she created, showing the amount of money at each category for recruiting. So you could look at her charts and see exactly where the huge discrepancies were. And she would take that to every meeting. And so when people would say, well, that's not, you don't need that much money, she would pull out her charts and just start going through. So she never went to a meeting unprepared. And that's something we all should keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. What do you think her, I mean, we talk about the greatest frustrations being the vote for the NCAA to take over the AIAW. What are some of her things that she's most proud of, would you say?
The thing she is undoubtedly most proud of is having a school named after her.
Oh,
That was the crown. She considered that her crowning achievement because education is at the core of everything she represented.
well, and I love that. And I love that the campaign to name the school in North Liberty after Christine Grant was initially led by a letter written by Coach Lisa Bluter.
Yes, it was.
Just so meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
That I went to the luncheon where they told her that was going to happen, and she had tears in her eyes. It's the first time I've seen her at a public meeting where the tears just came. But you know, she started her career as an elementary teacher, and she would say, it seems in almost every instance that she spoke, in some way she would come back to education is what we're concerned with. If we don't educate our youth, you know, what are we doing? And she believed in that. She loved she would get letters from dads who would say, my daughter is in the 4th grade and she was going to write something about you. Would you mind if I brought her by just to meet you? We won't stay long. And that just thrilled her. And I don't know how many of those she had over time. In fact, in going through some things now, I thought, I didn't know that happened. I didn't know she did that. So she just, it was always worth her while to get to know the people, the students, the student athletes. You ask what she's proudest of. I think she's proudest of all of you who are now in positions. That was her goal. Her goal was to get women all across the country to be in position to do something about athletics, about education. I think she always would say to students when she spoke to student groups or the tennis team, it's what you do with your whole life that's important. You know, if you want to be a lawyer, then set your goal and figure out how to get there. And then we as the ones before you have to make sure doors are open. So,
was there a time when she could look back on the data from the passage of 1972 to now 50 years, where she could see the real stats on women in political office, women at CEO level leadership, women in higher education, and kind of marvel at some of that, but then on the other side, also tell me about what she thought needed to continue to happen?
I think she was pleased with the progress she saw, but what she always saw first and foremost was how much farther we had to go, the miles to go before we sleep.
yeah, she was, and I think Christine was one of a group of women during those years who just felt that if we're going to if we're going to change this world, we have to have a systematic way of doing it. We can't just go out and shout, although that's a part of it. But we have to have data to show. Nothing infuriated her more than for people to say women are not interested in sport. I mean, you were talking about when she got angry, and she did get angry. You saw a lot of anger in Christine. But as you say, she controlled it and she focused it where it could matter. But
all of these incredible experiences and important, impactful work. I'm in awe of all of it. I really am. All I can hope is to have a legacy that is some small percentage of what you guys have done. So it's such an incredible source of pride for me personally, and to be coming from this institution and this athletic department. What, in looking back on all of this, what are the greatest lessons that you have learned and the advice that you have for me, people like me that want to continue to advocate and do whatever we can to make positive impacts in our society?
Well, I have a note card at home, and I'm afraid I can't attribute it right now, but it says, "My advice to the women of America is to raise more hell and fewer dahlias." I happen to like flowers, so I think we can do both.
I love that. That's great. I might have to find that too, Peggy.
yeah, I think I think you are on the road that Christine would be so proud of. And I think women like you in your stage of career, being able to see what came before you, because we all know that matters, and what path you would like those you work with, and particularly those you mentor, to be on when you finish your career. I think too often people think, well, I went to college, I got my degree, I'll go to work in an office and that'll be it. And I think particularly for women in athletics, although the opportunities now are just incredible for those of us who didn't have opportunities like that, you have to see that there's still work to be done, and there's still organizational issues that will always come up, and you have to be prepared. Again, as Christine would say, know your history, and figure out a place that you want to take others to.
I would say to you, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
You have found your voice, and through your podcast, you have found a way to amplify it, and that's extremely important.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peg. We are preparing to celebrate Dr. Christine Grant's life with a Celebration of Life memorial service at Carver Hawkeye Arena. And in preparing to really reflect on her life and celebrate her, I'm curious if maybe we could end today with each of you, if you're willing, to share some of your thoughts as we do our best to really give meaning and celebration to such a life well lived.
Well, I think she threatened us with our very lives if it was anything other than a celebration.
Very good.
She did not want it to be funereal in any way. She wants it to be a celebration, and that's what we intend to do.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think, and she sees it as a celebration of all of athletics, and particularly women. And I think she sees it as a celebration that will take people forward with the struggles that they'll have in the future.
we're pretty darn lucky to have had Dr. Grant, and it really is only something that we should smile about.
Indeed.
And she also would not want you to forget that she grew up in Bo'ness, Scotland.
Bonus Scotland.
And how important her Scottish heritage is.
I am looking forward to some Scottish bagpipes
Yeah.
at this celebration of life, and I know she would love that.
Yep.
I can't thank you each enough for joining me today and having this very thoughtful, important conversation that means so much to me and I know to our Hawkeye listeners. And I wish both of you all the best with enormous gratitude and appreciation for all that you have done, and look forward to celebrating Dr. Grant here at Cover Hawkeye on Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As always, go Hawks.
This has been HERkys Voice. The mission of the HERkys program is to help our Hawkeye community learn, support, and engage with Iowa women's athletics. To learn more about the HERkys initiative, visit herkys.hawkeyesports.com. Hawkeye fans, remember to hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. Once you become a Fight for Iowa podcast subscriber, you'll automatically receive the latest episodes of the Fight for Iowa podcast, the HERkys Voice podcast, Hawk Talk replays, exclusive game day content, and more. The preceding has been a Learfield presentation on the Hawkeye Sports Network.